Unaware his pregnant wife just won a $50 million government contract, he serves her divorce papers minutes after she burst triplets, but he forgot to read the prenup, and what she did left him devastated. The labor room still echoed with the first cries of 3 newborns when Daniel Hartford pulled the folded documents from his jacket pocket, his hands steady despite his wife Melissa's exhausted smile. But the ink on those papers represented only half the story unfolding in that sterile hospital room. What Daniel didn't know as he placed his signature on the final page was that exactly 47 minutes earlier, while Melissa pushed through her final contraction, her phone had buzzed with a notification that would transform her from a struggling architect into one of the most powerful developers in the state. But the prenuptial agreement he'd convinced her to sign 5 years ago contained a clause his lawyer had warned him about. A clause he dismissed as irrelevant because he never imagined his wife would become wealthier than his entire family combined. The 3 babies sleeping in their plastic bassinets had no idea their father was about to walk away from the woman who just secured their future. But they also couldn't know that their mother had been planning her next move for months, waiting for the precise moment when Daniel would reveal his true character. Would Daniel discover what he'd just lost before the hospital doors closed behind him? Would Melissa's devastating response teach him that underestimating your partner comes with consequences no amount of regret can undo? Could the prenup he forgot to read become the very weapon that would dismantle everything he thought he'd gained by leaving? The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart Medical Center cast harsh shadows across Melissa Hartford's face as she lay in the hospital bed, her body still trembling from the ordeal of bringing 3 lives into the world. But her eyes held a clarity that contradicted her physical exhaustion. The triplets, 2 girls and a boy, were already being examined by the neonatal team in the corner of the room, their tiny fingers curling and uncurling in that instinctive way newborns have. But Daniel Hartford stood apart from the scene, checking his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. He'd been waiting for this moment for months, perhaps even years, but the timing had to be perfect. Had to be when Melissa was too exhausted to fight, too overwhelmed to think clearly about what was happening. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Melissa whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming. But Daniel barely glanced at the babies before returning his attention to his phone. The contrast between her maternal wonder and his cold detachment would have been jarring to any observer. But the 2 nurses in the room had seen enough dysfunctional families to know when to keep their opinions to themselves. What Daniel didn't realize as he scrolled through his messages was that Melissa's phone, sitting silently on the bedside table, contained an email that had arrived at 3:47 p.m., exactly 47 minutes before he'd decided to serve her with divorce papers. But the timing was about to prove catastrophic for his carefully laid plans. The email's subject line read, "Approved, Hartford Architecture Firm, Federal Infrastructure Development Contract, your FB 224-8847. But Daniel was too focused on his own agenda to notice the way Melissa's eyes occasionally drifted to that phone, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips despite her exhaustion. The backstory of their relationship painted a picture that made this moment almost inevitable, though neither of them had seen it coming 5 years earlier when they'd stood before a justice of the peace in a simple ceremony that Daniel's mother had called rushing into disaster. But Melissa had loved him then with the kind of fierce devotion that overlooks red flags and interprets warning signs as challenges to overcome. Daniel Hartford came from old money, the kind of wealth that spans generations and breeds a particular type of entitlement. But his family's fortune had been dwindling for decades, eroded by poor investments and even poorer judgment. Melissa Chen, she'd kept her maiden name professionally even after marriage, had come from nothing. The daughter of immigrants who'd worked 16-hour days in a laundromat to send her to state college. But her talent for architectural design had caught the attention of several prestigious firms before she'd even graduated. They'd met at a fundraising gala where Daniel had been representing his family's charitable foundation, a tax shelter masquerading as philanthropy, though Melissa hadn't understood that at the time. But she'd been there presenting her thesis project on sustainable urban development for low-income communities. Daniel had been charmed by her passion and drive, qualities his own social circle conspicuously lacked. But he'd also seen something else, an opportunity to appear progressive and forward-thinking to his family's board of directors while securing a wife who would be too grateful for his name and connections to question his authority in the relationship. The prenuptial agreement had been Daniel's mother's idea, presented to Melissa 2 weeks before their wedding with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. But what made the document particularly insidious was how it had been framed. "It's just to protect both of you," Victoria Hartford had said, her diamond rings catching the light in the lawyer's office as Melissa read through the pages. But every clause seemed designed to ensure that if the marriage ended, Melissa would leave with nothing more than she'd brought into it. The Hartford family assets would remain untouchable, Daniel's inheritance would be protected, and any business ventures started during the marriage would be considered joint property, meaning Daniel would have claim to half of everything Melissa built, but she would have no claim to anything he inherited or already owned. But there was one clause that Daniel's lawyer, an old family friend named Robert Thornton, had specifically highlighted during their private meeting. A clause that Daniel had waved away with the arrogance of someone who couldn't imagine circumstances ever turning against him. Clause 7.3b stated that, in the event of divorce, if either party's net worth exceeded the other's by a factor of 10 or more at the time of separation, the standard division of assets would be suspended, and instead the wealthier party would receive full control of all marital assets, including any business interests, properties, or financial holdings acquired during the marriage. But with one critical stipulation: this clause would only activate if the divorce was initiated by the party of lesser net worth at the time of signing, meaning if Melissa, who'd brought virtually nothing into the marriage, somehow became significantly wealthier than Daniel and then filed for divorce, she would claim everything. "You're putting in a poison pill clause that could destroy you if circumstances change," Robert had warned. But Daniel had laughed at the suggestion. "She's an architect, Robert, not a tech billionaire. Her salary will never come close to my family's holdings. This clause is meaningless. It'll never be triggered because I'll be the one initiating any divorce. And when I do, the standard terms will apply." The lawyer had persisted, his fingers drumming on the mahogany desk in his corner office. But Daniel's mind was already made up. What you're not considering is that she could build something significant. She could start a firm, win major contracts. If her net worth ever exceeds yours by that margin and circumstances change, then I'll make sure I'm the one who files first, Daniel had interrupted, standing to leave. But Robert's final words had followed him out the door. "Just make sure you know exactly where you both stand financially before you make any moves. This clause has teeth, Daniel. Don't let it bite you." That conversation had taken place 4.5 years ago. But as Daniel stood in the hospital room preparing to serve his wife with divorce papers, he'd completely forgotten about Clause 7.3b because in his mind, the financial landscape hadn't changed at all. He still had access to his family's remaining wealth, approximately $8 million in various trusts and properties, though much of it was tied up in illiquid assets. But what he didn't know was that Melissa's net worth had just jumped from roughly $200,000 in savings and business equity to over $50 million with the stroke of a government official's pen. The federal infrastructure contract she'd been awarded that afternoon wasn't just any government job, but rather the cornerstone of a 10-year development initiative to rebuild urban centers across 5 states with sustainable, affordable housing and community spaces. Melissa's firm, Hartford Architecture and Development, she'd used Daniel's surname for the business, thinking it showed unity in their marriage. But that decision was about to have consequences neither of them had anticipated. Would receive $50 million in initial funding, with performance clauses that could extend the contract's total value to over $200 million throughout its duration. But more importantly, the contract came with an equity stake in the developments themselves, meaning Melissa wouldn't just be earning fees, she'd be building generational wealth. The backstory of how Melissa had positioned herself for this opportunity revealed a woman far more strategic than Daniel had ever given her credit for. But then again, he'd never really paid attention to her work beyond the occasional dismissive comment about playing with blueprints. 3 years into their marriage, after Daniel's mother had made one too many comments about Melissa knowing her place in the Hartford family, Melissa had quietly started documenting every business connection Daniel had promised to provide but never delivered. Every networking opportunity he'd sabotaged by showing up late or drunk to events where she was presenting. Every time he'd taken credit for her ideas when speaking to his family's business associates, but she hadn't done this out of spite, at least not initially. The documentation had started as a way to understand whether she was being paranoid or whether Daniel really was undermining her career, but the pattern that emerged was undeniable. Daniel needed Melissa to be successful enough to make him look good, but not so successful that she'd overshadow him, or worse, become financially independent enough to leave him. But he'd miscalculated how much ambition Melissa actually possessed beneath her gentle demeanor. While he was spending his afternoons at his gentleman's club and his evenings with a rotating cast of business associates who all seemed to be attractive women in their 20s, Melissa was building relationships with government officials, urban planning committees, and nonprofit organizations focused on sustainable development. The pregnancy had been unplanned, or at least unplanned by Melissa, though she'd later discover that Daniel had been tampering with her birth control because his mother had been pressuring him about producing heirs. But even that betrayal had been something Melissa had swallowed and adapted to. When the ultrasound at 8 weeks had revealed triplets, Daniel's reaction had been telling. Not joy or fear, but calculation. But Melissa had watched him mentally tabulating the costs of 3 children, the impact on her ability to work, the way this would tie her to him more permanently than any prenuptial agreement ever could. But what Daniel hadn't counted on was that Melissa's pregnancy, far from slowing her career momentum, had actually accelerated it, but in ways that had nothing to do with sympathy or special treatment. The Federal Infrastructure Initiative specifically sought firms led by diverse founders who understood the communities they'd be serving, and Melissa's background, combined with her innovative designs that maximized both sustainability and affordability, had made her firm the ideal candidate. But the pregnancy had also lit a fire under her to secure her children's future, independent of the Hartford family's declining fortune. She'd submitted her proposal for the government contract in her second trimester, working 18-hour days while Daniel complained that she wasn't paying enough attention to preparing the nursery. But she'd known, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from living with someone whose mask occasionally slips, that Daniel was looking for an exit. The way he'd started working out obsessively and buying expensive clothes, the sudden interest in appearing at social events without her, the phone calls he'd take in other rooms, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up when she entered. All of it pointed to someone preparing to upgrade his life, and that upgrade didn't include a wife with a rapidly expanding waistline carrying 3 babies. The flashback that haunted Melissa most frequently in her third trimester had occurred 6 months into her pregnancy, when she'd overheard Daniel on the phone with his mother in his home office. But the door had been slightly ajar, and his voice had carried into the hallway where Melissa had been standing, frozen in place. "I know, Mother, but I need to wait until after the babies are born. It looks better that way, like I tried to make it work but couldn't handle the stress of triplets." Robert says judges are more sympathetic to men who leave after a traumatic birth rather than during pregnancy. Plus, with her tied down with 3 infants, she won't have the energy or resources to fight the divorce terms. Victoria Hartford's response had been muffled, but Daniel's next words had been crystal clear. "Don't worry about the prenup. She signed it without really reading it, and even if she's made some money with her little architecture hobby, she hasn't made enough to trigger any of those protective clauses Robert was worried about. When I file, the standard terms apply. I keep my family money, and we split whatever she's built during the marriage, which means I get half of her firm's value. It's perfect. I get out of a marriage to someone who was never really our social equal anyway, and I get a payout from her business." That conversation had changed everything for Melissa, but not in the way Daniel might have expected if he'd known she'd heard it. Instead of confronting him or collapsing in despair, she'd walked calmly back to her bedroom, picked up her phone, and called Robert Thornton directly. But she hadn't identified herself or mentioned what she'd overheard. Instead, she'd posed as a potential client, asking general questions about prenuptial agreements and divorce law, specifically about cases where financial circumstances changed dramatically during a marriage. Robert, who'd never met Melissa and didn't recognize her voice over the phone, had been professionally thorough in his explanation, But when she'd asked about poison pill clauses and what would happen if the supposedly less wealthy spouse suddenly came into significant money, his response had been illuminating. Those clauses are rare, and frankly, I advise against them because they can backfire spectacularly. I had one client who insisted on including language that protected his assets, but gave his wife everything if she became substantially wealthier and initiated divorce. He assumed she never would, but she ended up selling a startup for $30 million, found out he was cheating, and filed for divorce. The prenup he'd designed to protect himself became the weapon she used to take everything he thought was safe, including his share of her business and their marital home. Melissa had thanked him, hung up, and then spent the next 2 hours in her office reading and rereading her own prenuptial agreement until she found it. Clause 73B, buried on page 43 of a 50-page document. But the implications were staggering. If her net worth exceeded Daniel's by a factor of 10 or more at the time of separation, and if she was the one to file for divorce, or if the circumstances of his filing could be contested, she would have grounds to claim full control of all marital assets. But more importantly, the clause included language about unconscionable conduct that could void the standard protections Daniel assumed he had. The provision stated that if either party engaged in willful concealment of financial information, deliberate sabotage of the other party's career or earning potential, or initiation of divorce proceedings under false pretenses or with intent to gain unfair financial advantage, the injured party could petition to have the standard terms of the prenuptial agreement voided in favor of an equitable distribution determined by the court, but with a presumption in favor of the injured party retaining control of assets they had personally developed or earned. Melissa had immediately consulted with her own lawyer, not a friend of the Hartford family, but a sharp divorce attorney named Patricia Reeves, who specialized in cases where prenuptial agreements were contested, but Patricia's assessment had been cautiously optimistic. If you can prove he's planning to divorce you specifically to claim half your business while protecting his own assets, and if you can demonstrate that his timing is calculated to catch you at your most vulnerable, you might have grounds to challenge the prenup. But you'd need evidence of his intent and his deception. From that moment on, Melissa had been quietly gathering that evidence, but she'd also been racing to secure the government contract before Daniel made his move because she understood the financial threshold clause 7.3b required. Daniel's accessible net worth was approximately $8 million, which meant she needed to be worth at least $80 million for the clause to potentially activate. But the government contract, with its full 10-year potential, would put her well over that threshold. And the initial $50 million payment alone was enough to create the 10-to-1 ratio if Daniel's assets were properly appraised at their actual liquid value rather than the inflated numbers his family liked to claim. Now standing in that hospital room mere hours after giving birth to 3 children, Melissa watched Daniel approach her bed with papers in hand. But her exhaustion was at least partly performance because she needed him to believe she was too weak and overwhelmed to understand what was happening. She needed him to serve her with divorce papers right now, in this moment, because the timestamp on those papers combined with the timestamp on the government contract approval email would create a narrative that even the most sympathetic judge would find damning. A husband divorcing his wife minutes after she gave birth to triplets, unaware that she just secured a $50 million contract that he now had no legal claim to. "Melissa, we need to talk," Daniel said, but his tone was businesslike rather than gentle, and he made no move to touch her or check on the babies, who were now being wheeled back toward their mother in their individual bassinets. "I know the timing isn't ideal, but I think we both know this marriage hasn't been working for a while." Melissa let her eyes fill with tears. Not entirely difficult given the hormones flooding her system and the genuine pain she felt at having her suspicions confirmed. But she didn't speak. She needed him to continue, needed him to say the things that would demonstrate his callousness and calculation for the audio recording app she'd activated on her phone before going into labor. But Daniel interpreted her silence as shocked confusion and pressed forward. "I've had my attorney draw up divorce papers," he continued, placing the documents on the bedside table next to her phone. But he was so focused on his script that he didn't notice the notification light blinking on her device. I think a clean break is best for both of us. You'll be able to focus on the babies without the distraction of a failing marriage. And well, the details are all in the paperwork. I'm being very fair, Melissa. The prenup protects both of us, and you'll get exactly what you're entitled to under its terms. Which is what, exactly? Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was something in her tone that should have warned Daniel he was walking into a trap. He didn't catch it. Well, you keep whatever personal assets you brought into the marriage, obviously, and we split any business interests acquired during our time together. Since your firm was started after we got married, I'm entitled to half its value, but don't worry, I'm not going to force a sale. I'll accept a payout over time so you can keep operating. I'm also willing to let you keep the house since you'll need the space for the kids, though technically it's marital property. See? I'm being more than fair. More than fair, Melissa repeated, but she still didn't move to take the papers, and her eyes drifted to her phone, where another notification had just appeared. This one from Patricia Reeves with a message that simply read, "Contract confirmed. I'm ready when you are." The pieces were all in place now, but Melissa needed one more element to make her countermove devastating. "And when did you decide this, Daniel? When did you decide our marriage was over?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, but his answer would be his undoing. "Does it matter? The point is we're not happy. We haven't been for a long time. I'm just being honest enough to acknowledge it instead of letting us waste more years pretending." "So this is about honesty?" Melissa asked. And now there was something sharp underneath her exhaustion. About not wasting time pretending? That's interesting, Daniel, because I'm wondering if you've been honest with me about a few things. Like how long you've been planning this, or why you chose to serve me with divorce papers less than an hour after I gave birth to your children. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to realize this wasn't going according to plan, but he'd come too far to back down now. "I chose now because I didn't want you to waste energy during your pregnancy worrying about our marriage. I was trying to be considerate." "Considerate," Melissa said, and she finally reached for her phone, but instead of looking at Daniel's divorce papers, she opened her email and turned the screen toward him. "Is it also considerate that you're divorcing me on the same day I was awarded a $50 million government contract? Or did you somehow not know about that?" The color drained from Daniel's face as he stared at the email on her screen, his eyes scanning the subject line and the first few paragraphs visible in the preview. But Melissa watched him process the information in real time. She could almost see the calculations running through his mind. $50 million was more than his entire family's remaining net worth, which meant the financial dynamic he'd been assuming no longer existed. But more than that, if she'd won this contract before he served her with divorce papers, it meant the prenup, he said, his voice hollow. Clause 7(b). "You remember it after all," Melissa said, sitting up straighter in her hospital bed despite the pain the movement caused. "I wondered if you would. See, Daniel, I've been doing a lot of reading over the past 6 months. Did you know that prenuptial agreements can be challenged in court if one party can demonstrate that the other acted in bad faith or with intent to deceive? And did you know that serving your wife with divorce papers mere minutes after she gives birth to triplets, while being unaware that she just secured a contract worth more than 10 times your net worth, creates exactly the kind of optics that judges find unconscionable?" Daniel's lawyer brain was finally catching up to his situation, but the panic in his eyes suggested he understood how thoroughly he'd miscalculated. "You can't prove I knew about the contract. I'll say I found out afterward." "But you didn't find out afterward," Melissa interrupted, picking up her phone and tapping the screen. "You found out right now at 4:34 p.m. when I showed you my email. And I served you with divorce papers at 4:32 p.m. according to the timestamp on these documents. Which means you initiated divorce proceedings against your wife, who had just given birth to triplets, fully believing that you would be entitled to half of her business under the prenup's standard terms. The fact that you didn't know I'd just become $50 million richer doesn't help your case, Daniel. It actually makes it worse, because it shows that your timing and your calculations were based entirely on taking advantage of me at my most vulnerable moment." The nurses in the corner of the room had stopped even pretending not to listen. But Melissa didn't care. She'd been waiting months for this moment, and the satisfaction of watching Daniel realize what he'd done to himself was worth any embarrassment. Patricia Reeves is my attorney, Melissa continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. You might know her. She's the one who took down Gregory Hammond in that prenup case 3 years ago. The one where the husband tried to divorce his wife the day after she inherited $20 million from her grandmother, not knowing that she'd already started divorce proceedings 2 days earlier, based on evidence of his affairs. The judge voided their prenup entirely and awarded her everything, including his family's vacation home. Daniel sank into the chair beside her bed, the divorce papers still clutched in his hand, but his grip had gone slack. This was supposed to be simple, he said, but he was talking to himself more than to her. It was simple, Daniel, Melissa said, and now there was genuine sadness in her voice. But sadness tinged with something that might have been pity or might have been triumph. You made it simple by being exactly who you are, someone who sees other people as assets to be managed or obstacles to be removed. You never saw me as a partner or even as a person with my own agency and ambition. I was just the girl from the wrong side of town who should have been grateful you married her, and when I stopped being useful to your image, you decided to cash out. I loved you, Daniel protested weakly, but even he didn't seem to believe it. Maybe you did in the beginning, Melissa acknowledged, looking at her 3 sleeping babies, who were oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Or maybe you loved the version of me that existed in your head, the grateful, pliable wife who would make you look progressive and forward-thinking without ever challenging your authority or outgrowing your usefulness. But you certainly didn't love me enough to wait more than an hour after I gave birth to your children before trying to leave me. The full implications of his situation were finally dawning on Daniel, but Melissa wasn't finished. She picked up his divorce papers and began flipping through them, her eyes scanning the terms he'd had his attorney prepare. Let's see. You want half of Hartford Architecture and Development, which you estimated to be worth approximately $400,000 based on last year's revenues. That would have given you $200,000, plus you'd keep all your family money. Not a bad deal for you, especially since you'd also have gotten out of supporting me through raising 3 infants. But here's what's actually going to happen, she continued, setting the papers down and meeting his eyes with a gaze that held no mercy. I'm going to file my own divorce petition tomorrow morning. I'm going to cite your emotional abandonment, your sabotaging of my career over the past 5 years. And yes, I have documentation of every meeting you made us late for, every business contact you promised to introduce me to, but never did, every time you undermined my work in front of your family. I'm going to present the audio recording I have of this conversation, where you admitted to timing this divorce to coincide with when I'd be most vulnerable and least able to fight back. Daniel's head snapped up. You're recording this? I've been recording every significant conversation we've had for the past 3 months, Melissa said calmly, including the one where you told your mother you were waiting until after the triplets were born because it would look better in court. You remember that conversation, don't you? The one you had in your office 6 months ago with the door slightly open? The look on Daniel's face confirmed what Melissa had suspected. He hadn't realized she'd overheard, and he certainly hadn't known she'd been planning for this moment ever since. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Melissa picked up her phone again and played a snippet of audio. Daniel's voice, clear and unmistakable, saying Robert says judges are more sympathetic to men who leave after a traumatic birth rather than during pregnancy. The sound of his own words seemed to physically wound Daniel, but Melissa pressed on. Under Clause 7.3b of our prenuptial agreement, when one party's net worth exceeds the other's by a factor of 10 or more, and that party files for divorce, the standard asset division is suspended. My net worth, as of this afternoon, is approximately $50 million. Your net worth, when properly appraised at liquid value, rather than your family's inflated estimates, is approximately $4.2 million. That's nearly a 12-to-1 ratio, Daniel. Furthermore, she continued, and now her voice had taken on the analytical tone she used when presenting to clients, the unconscionable conduct provision means that I can petition to void the standard protections you assumed you had. Patricia believes we have an excellent case for arguing that you engaged in deliberate sabotage of my career and initiated divorce proceedings under false pretenses with intent to gain unfair financial advantage. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, and the defeat in his voice was absolute. Melissa considered the question, looking from her ex-husband, because that's what he'd become the moment he'd placed those papers on her bedside table, to her 3 children. "I want a divorce, Daniel, but on my terms. I want full custody of the triplets with visitation for you. Supervised at first until I'm confident you actually care about them rather than just seeing them as leverage. I want child support based on your actual income, not your family's wealth. I want you to sign over any claim to my business, my earnings, and any future contracts or opportunities I develop. And in exchange," as she added, "I won't pursue the full provisions of Clause 73B. I won't try to take your family money or the trust funds your mother set up for you. I'll let you walk away with what you brought into this marriage, which is more than you were willing to let me leave with. Do you see the difference, Daniel? I'm actually being fair, even though the law would allow me to devastate you the way you plan to devastate me." Daniel sat silently for a long moment, but there was nothing left to negotiate. He'd miscalculated everything: the timing, Melissa's awareness of his plans, her financial situation, and most critically, the actual terms of the prenuptial agreement he'd been so confident would protect him. "I'll have my attorney contact Patricia," he finally said, standing up with the defeated posture of a man who just realized he'd destroyed his own life. "One more thing," Melissa said as he moved toward the door. "I need you to understand something, Daniel. This isn't revenge. This is consequences. You made choices based on the assumption that I would always be less than you, less wealthy, less powerful, less capable of protecting myself. You were so certain of your superiority that you forgot to consider that the woman you married might have been learning from you all along, studying how you and your family operated, understanding the games you played. You taught me to be strategic, Daniel. You just didn't realize I'd eventually use those lessons against you." Daniel paused at the door, his hand on the handle, but when he turned back, there was something in his expression that might have been respect or might have been horror. "You planned this whole thing," he said. "The timing, the contract, letting me serve you with papers. You manipulated me into destroying myself." "No," Melissa corrected gently. "You destroyed yourself. I just refused to be destroyed along with you. There's a difference." After Daniel left, the room fell into a silence broken only by the soft sounds of 3 sleeping babies. But one of the nurses approached Melissa's bed with a look of undisguised admiration. "I've worked in labor and delivery for 15 years, she said quietly, "and I have never seen anything like that. How are you even coherent right now? Most women are barely conscious an hour after delivering triplets." Melissa smiled tiredly, finally allowing herself to show her exhaustion. "Adrenaline is a powerful thing," she said, "and I've been preparing for this moment for months. I couldn't afford to fall apart until after I dealt with him." "Can I ask you something?" the nurse continued. "Did you really plan all of this? Winning the contract, letting him serve you with papers, the recording, all of it?" "Not exactly," Melissa admitted. "I couldn't control when the government would approve the contract, but I made sure I was in the best position possible when it happened, and I knew Daniel was planning to leave. I'd known for months. I just had to ensure that when he made his move, I'd be ready to counter it. The recording, the documentation of his sabotage, consulting with Patricia about the prenup, those were all preparation for something I hoped wouldn't happen, but suspected would." The nurse nodded slowly. "And the timing? Him serving you right after the contract was approved?" "That was luck," Melissa said, "or maybe karma. But when I saw the notification come through while I was in labor, I knew I had to stay focused, had to make sure I captured everything that happened next. Because if Daniel was going to divorce me today, and I knew he would, he'd been acting strange all morning, checking his watch, making phone calls, then I needed the timeline to show exactly what he was doing and why." Over the following weeks, the story of what happened in that hospital room would become something of a legend in legal circles, particularly among divorce attorneys who specialized in prenuptial agreements. But the full details remained confidential due to the settlement negotiations between Patricia Reeves and Daniel's attorney. What became public record was simply that Melissa Hartford had filed for divorce from Daniel Hartford 3 days after giving birth to triplets, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking full custody with supervised visitation. But the financial settlement remained sealed. What wasn't public was the full extent of what Melissa had negotiated and how thoroughly she'd protected not just herself, but her children's futures. Daniel signed over all claims to Hartford Architecture and Development, agreed to child support payments that would continue until all three children finished college, and relinquished any right to contest Melissa's business decisions or career choices. But in exchange, Melissa allowed him to keep his family's remaining assets and didn't pursue the full devastation that Clause 73B could have enabled. Some might have argued that Melissa was being too generous, but she'd never been motivated by revenge. She'd been motivated by security for herself and for her children. And she'd achieved that without destroying Daniel completely. But Daniel's life post-divorce became a cautionary tale nonetheless. The story of how he'd served his wife with divorce papers minutes after she'd given birth to triplets, unaware that she'd just won a $50 million government contract, spread through their social circles with the speed of scandal, and while the financial details remained private, the moral judgment was swift and harsh. Daniel's mother, Victoria, tried to spin the narrative in her son's favor, but the basic facts were too damning. His sisters, who'd never particularly liked Melissa but had respected her work ethic, were horrified by the timeline, and several family friends quietly distanced themselves from the Hartford name. But more significantly, Daniel found that his dating prospects had dried up dramatically. The women in his social circle, the ones he'd assumed would be lining up to date a newly single man from an established family, wanted nothing to do with someone who'd abandoned his wife and newborn triplets so callously. Meanwhile, Melissa's career trajectory became the stuff of professional legend, but the government infrastructure contract was just the beginning. With her reputation for innovative, sustainable design now backed by federal endorsement and $50 million in funding, other opportunities began flooding in. Private developers seeking to partner on mixed-use projects, city governments requesting proposals for urban renewal initiatives, even a TED Talk invitation to discuss the intersection of architecture and social justice. But through it all, Melissa maintained the same steady focus that had gotten her through that hospital room confrontation. She hired a live-in nanny to help with the triplets. 3 children under one roof would have been overwhelming for anyone, let alone a single mother running a rapidly expanding business. But she also made sure to be present for the important moments. First smiles, first words, first steps. She'd fought too hard to secure their future to miss their childhood. And she'd learned from watching Daniel's family that wealth without presence created hollow relationships. The triplets, Emma, Sophie, and James, would grow up knowing their father only through supervised visitation that gradually expanded as Daniel proved he could be consistent and present. But they would never doubt their mother's love or commitment. The story of what had happened in that hospital room would remain a secret until they were much older. But by then, they'd already understand that their mother was someone who'd built something remarkable through talent, preparation, and the kind of strategic thinking that comes from having to fight for everything you achieve. As for the prenuptial agreement that had caused so much chaos, Patricia Reeves would use a redacted version of the case in her lectures on contract law and family law. But she always emphasized the same point. Prenuptial agreements are designed to protect both parties in the event of divorce, but they can only do that if both parties understand what they're signing and approach the marriage in good faith. When one party views the agreement as a weapon to be used against the other, they often forget that weapons can be turned against their wielder. The Hartford case teaches us that underestimating your spouse, whether it's their intelligence, their ambition, or their capacity for strategic planning, is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make. Years later, when asked in an interview how she'd managed to build one of the most successful architecture firms in the country while raising triplets as a single mother, Melissa's answer would be characteristically pragmatic. I learned that the people who underestimate you give you an incredible advantage. They tell you their plans, they reveal their weaknesses, they make mistakes because they don't think you're paying attention. My ex-husband spent 5 years assuming I was too naive, too grateful, or too in love to see what he was doing. By the time he realized I'd been watching and learning the whole time, it was too late for him to protect himself from his own worst impulses. The reporter had pressed for more details about the divorce, but Melissa had simply smiled. Let's just say that timing is everything, and so is reading the fine print. Always read the fine print. Back in that hospital room, though, as Daniel's footsteps faded down the corridor and Melissa finally allowed herself to cry, from exhaustion, from relief, from grief over a marriage that had been dead long before either of them had acknowledged it, but also from hope for the future she just secured. The three babies who'd been born into such chaos continued sleeping peacefully, but they were unaware that their mother had just fought the most important battle of her life. The lesson wasn't just about prenuptial agreements or timing or revenge, though. The real lesson was something deeper. That love should never require you to make yourself smaller. That partnership should elevate both people rather than protecting one at the expense of the other. And that sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is refusing to be destroyed by someone else's miscalculation, but also refusing to destroy them in return when you have the power to do so. Melissa Hartford had been given a weapon, Clause 7.3b, and all the evidence of Daniel's bad faith that could have obliterated her ex-husband's life, but she'd chosen to use it precisely and sparingly, taking only what she needed to protect herself and her children, but leaving him with the ability to rebuild his life if he chose to learn from his mistakes. Whether Daniel would learn those lessons remained to be seen, but Melissa had already moved forward, and the three sleeping babies in their bassinets would grow up knowing that their mother was someone who'd turned her most vulnerable moment into her greatest triumph, not through cruelty or revenge, but through preparation, intelligence, and the courage to stand up for her worth when someone tried to diminish it. The story would end there in most tellings, with Melissa victorious and Daniel defeated. But life rarely offers such clean narratives, and the consequences of that day in the hospital would ripple forward in ways neither of them could have predicted. Because while Melissa had won the battle, she'd also set in motion a transformation in Daniel that would take years to unfold, a reckoning with the man he'd been and the man he might still become. But that would be a different story for a different time. For now, in that hospital room with three newborns and one exhausted mother, the story was simply this. She prepared for the worst, he delivered it right on schedule, and when the moment came, she'd been ready. But what she'd done with that readiness, choosing protection over destruction, security over revenge, that was what would define not just her victory, but her character.